Hello, welcome. I'm Nomia Iqbal. In Mexico, the army has confirmed the death of one of the country's most feared drug lords, known as El Mencho, caught and killed in a dawn raid. He was killed in an operation in the town of Telpapa. The US had previously issued a $15 million reward for the capture of the co-founder and leader of the Jalisco New Generation drugs cartel. It's feared for its use of extreme violence. Violence broke out in the country.
Let me take you back to a small, forgotten town. A place most people have never heard of, and honestly, a place that the rest of the world had no reason to think about. Tucked away in the hills of a poor region in southern Brazil, there was a village called Riachão do Sorteio. No paved roads, no real schools to speak of. And for the people who lived there, no real future either, at least not the kind that comes through honest work alone. That is where our story begins. In 1966, a boy was born into that silence. His name, the name his mother gave him, was Marcos Pereira da Silva. Just Marcos. A simple name for a simple beginning. He grew up watching his father and uncles work the dry land from sunrise to sunset, earning just enough to survive. There was no shame in that life, but there was also no way out. The roads in and out of Riachão do Sorteio were rough and broken. If you wanted something better, you had to leave. And so, like many young men before him, Marcos eventually packed what little he had and made his way north, across the border, into Venezuela, and then further on, chasing whatever opportunity he could find. He found odd jobs. He found movement. He found people operating in the shadows of the law. But life in the north did not open doors the way he had hoped. By the late 1980s, Marcos had crossed into Colombia and drifted into circles where men made money not from the land, but from what moved beneath it, drugs. He was arrested. He was charged. And just like that, he was sent back. Deported. Pushed back to the same dusty roads he had tried to escape. But here's the thing about a man who has seen the other side of the world. He does not come back the same. Marcos returned to Brazil carrying something invisible but powerful: knowledge. He now understood how the trade worked. He understood borders, routes, risks, and rewards. He came back with a map in his head that no one around him had. And that map, as we will see, would eventually change everything. Not just for him, for a whole country. When Marcos came home, the criminal world in Brazil was already organized, but just barely. There were groups operating in São Paulo, Rio, the Northeast, each with their own territory, their own rules, their own bosses. It was not a clean structure. It was more like a web of agreements that could snap at any moment. He did not walk into a boardroom and announce himself. That is not how these worlds work. He started small. He made himself useful. He handled logistics, getting product from one place to another without it being traced, without it being lost, without anyone important getting arrested. These are unglamorous jobs, but they are how trust is built in that world. Over time, the people around him began to notice something. Marcos was calm. He was consistent. He did not drink too much, did not talk too much, did not make promises he could not keep. In a world full of men who were reckless and loud, his quiet reliability was almost magnetic. He was not the kind of man who needed attention. He was the kind of man who got things done. The early 2000s brought change, the kind that comes not from planning, but from destruction. Federal authorities began cracking down hard. Major criminal organizations that had operated for years suddenly found their leaders behind bars. The structures that had held everything together began to crack. People scrambled. Alliances broke apart. Men who had once been powerful were now vulnerable. For most people in that world, this kind of chaos is a disaster. For Marcos, it was an opening. He watched carefully. He moved quietly. He began gathering around him a small group of men who thought the way he did, disciplined, forward-looking, willing to build rather than just survive. They did not have a name yet. They did not have a flag. But they had a vision. And in a landscape filled with rubble, that was enough to begin. Before the story continues, don't forget to subscribe, share, and like, cause this is just the beginning. Between 2007 and 2010, something new was born. It did not have a flashy beginning. There was no ceremony, no declaration. But slowly, what had been a small and nameless group became something with structure, with reach, with teeth. People started calling them the Nova Geração do Sol, the new generation of the South. And Marcos Pereira da Silva was at the center of it all. What made this group different was not just the violence, though there was plenty of that. What made them different was how they were organized. Where older groups had been loose and fragmented, the Nova Jerusalem was centralized. Everything flowed through one command, one direction, one decision-making structure. Marcos had studied the failures of others, and he had built something designed not to collapse the same way. They expanded fast. Territory that had been controlled by rivals was taken, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through force. Highways that moved goods through the interior of the country became their corridors. Ports that touched the Atlantic became their gateways. And the product they moved, cocaine, methamphetamine, and later fentanyl, found its way not just to Brazilian cities but outward, across the ocean, to Europe, to Africa, to Asia. People who lived in the communities they controlled felt it in different ways. Some felt a kind of rough order. The group imposed rules, punished theft, kept out rival gangs. But that order came at a cost. Anyone who crossed them faced consequences. Journalists who asked too many questions were threatened. Police officers who pushed too hard were targeted. The line between protection and terror was thin, and it moved depending on who was asking. By the time most of the country had fully noticed what was happening, the Nova Jerusalem had already grown into something that could not easily be undone. They were not just a gang anymore. They were a network, complex, layered, with roots in politics, in business, in law enforcement itself. Marcos had not just built a criminal organization. He had built a parallel system of power. And he sat quietly at the top of it all. There comes a point in every story like this when the world outside decides that enough is enough. For Marcos, that moment came when the United States government placed his name on an international most wanted list. Brazilian authorities had been looking for him for years. But now it was official, global, and public. His face was on posters. His name was in reports read in Washington, in Brussels, in Tokyo. Catching him was another matter entirely. He had not built his organization on ego. He did not live in a mansion with golden gates that could be photographed from a satellite. He moved constantly. He changed locations before intelligence could be confirmed. His inner circle was small and deeply loyal, men and women who had known him for decades, who had reasons of their own to keep him safe. There were moments when authorities believed they were close. Operations were launched. Helicopters flew over remote valleys. Raids were conducted on properties linked to the organization. Every time, they found traces, weapons, documents, evidence of recent habitation, but not the man himself. It was as if he had a sixth sense for danger, or perhaps more accurately, as if he had people everywhere who could warn him before the danger arrived. And yet, you could feel the walls closing in. Year after year, the net tightened. Associates were arrested. Informants came forward. Technology improved. The kind of communications that had once been invisible began to leave footprints. The world that had protected him was getting smaller, and he, whether he knew it or not, was running out of room. There is something deeply human about a chase like this. On one side, institutions with enormous power, with satellites and surveillance and international cooperation, trying to bring down one man. On the other side, one man, aging, hunted, carrying the weight of everything he had built, trying simply to survive. I am not asking you to feel sorry for him, but I am asking you to understand the scale of what this was. This was not a simple thing. This was years of human effort on both sides, playing out in the mountains and valleys of a country most of the world rarely thinks about. On the 22nd of February, 2026, it ended. Intelligence had tracked him to a small town called Serra Fria, a quiet place, surrounded by hills, the kind of place where a man might hope to disappear. Brazilian military forces moved in the early morning. The operation was precise and coordinated, but it was not clean. There was a confrontation. Shots were fired. Men on both sides were wounded. When the smoke cleared, Marcos Pereira da Silva was alive, but barely. He had been hit by gunfire and was rushed to a military medical facility. He did not survive. The man who had spent decades evading the world's most powerful law enforcement agencies died from his wounds on the same morning his story finally caught up with him. Within hours, the reaction began. Across several states, Vehicles were set on fire. Highways were blocked. Armed members of the Nova Jerusalem poured into streets in a display of coordinated rage and grief. People were killed. The National Guard was deployed. Cities locked down. It looked, for a moment, like the country itself was shaking, as if the removal of one man had somehow made things worse, not better. And that, I think, is the hardest part of this story to sit with. Because we might expect that when someone like Marcos is gone, there is relief, order, a kind of quiet that signals healing. But what the days after his death showed us is that the system he built did not die with him. It had grown beyond him. The machine kept running. The routes stayed open. The money kept moving. His organization adapted, as it always had, because he had built it to survive, without him. So, where does that leave us? What do we take from a story like this? I think we take this. One man's death, even the death of someone who caused immeasurable harm, does not fix the conditions that created him. A boy born in a forgotten town with no roads and no schools does not automatically become a criminal. But a world that offers nothing to children that is a world that is building its own problems. The machine Marcos built is still running. And until the world that made men like him decides to build something different, more schools, more roads, more dignity, there will always be another Marcos, in another forgotten town, reading the same broken map and choosing the same broken path. The man is gone. The story is not over. Follow for more.